Are you someone who feels anxious in your relationships? And by anxious, I mean you get very nervous when you don't get validation all the time. If the person you're dating or your partner doesn't text back right away, you start going into catastrophe thinking. And maybe you are kind of unable to regulate your own emotions, and therefore you're very emotionally needy. Then you might have an anxious attachment style. Let's dive into this a little bit more. So what is an anxious attachment style? Basically, attachment theory can help us define 4 different ways of relating to the people, the primary people in our lives. So there's the anxious attachment style, there's the avoidant attachment style, there's the fearful avoidant attachment style, and then there's the secure attachment style. The first 3 I mentioned are all insecure attachment styles, and the secure one is of course a secure attachment style. So anxious attachment means that you are someone who is very hypervigilant. Maybe you even call yourself an empath. You're someone who is super tuned in to everyone else's emotions. You want to people please. You want validation. You want to cling onto your relationships. You constantly need to be in contact. If there is an issue, if there is a problem, you want to talk about it right away because it feels unbearable for you to sit with that anxiety by yourself. And that's one of the key problems with the anxious attachment style. It's the inability to sit with feelings and regulate emotions by yourself. You need others to help you regulate. And that's why you end up becoming very needy in relationships. That's why many anxious people, they end up blaming their partners. It's because you are not here to talk to me. It's because you are not here to console me, etc. But at the end of the day, what the anxious attachment style person has to learn is to regulate their own emotions, to find that balance within themselves, and to stop looking for validation everywhere else. Right? The anxious attachment style is always created from some kind of either childhood trauma, childhood wounds, or from adult, relational trauma in adulthood. So that can be a terrible relationship. Let's say you were perfectly fine, then you ended up in a relationship with a narcissist and you completely spiraled out of control. Your self-esteem is gone and you were trained to be very, very anxious and hypervigilant. And so from that day on, you're suddenly anxious in your attachment style. But the most common scenario of what we see, and certainly what I see with my clients, is that it stems from childhood and from the relationship that you had with your primary caregivers, whether that was mom and dad or, whoever it was that was the primary person for you when you grew up. So the anxious attachment style is created it can be from childhood abandonment, from a very emotionally distant parent, a parent with an avoidant attachment style, for example, which means a parent who isn't emotionally available to the child, or who shifts from hot to cold, cold to hot, and you never know where they are. So that could also be a narcissistic parent, borderline parent. Growing up with someone where you constantly had to monitor and kind of figure out, where is this person right now and what do I need to do to stay safe around them, right? It can also come from being in a very enmeshed relationship with a parent or a caregiver, which means that you are somehow responsible for the parents or the caregiver's emotions. So that will be, for example, a mother who calls you her best friend, who tells you all of her adult problems and relies on you for emotional support. So a kid is not supposed to be in that position, right? We can all agree on that, but unfortunately it happens to many. That will also create an anxious attachment style, because you grew up learning that your safety, your emotional safety in the world depends on your ability read other people's emotions and to read them and to be responsible for other people's emotions. And so therefore you are constantly looking for validation, like, am I doing it good enough? Is it okay now? How are you now? Do you like me now? Are you happy now? I don't know if you can recognize that do you like me now syndrome. Many people experience it in dating, especially if they have the anxious attachment style, where they care more about whether or not the person they're dating likes them than they care about whether they actually like that person. Sometimes when I have a client who has an anxious attachment style, they haven't even reflected on whether or not they like the person they're dating. They are just completely preoccupied with whether or not that person likes them. And of course, there is the thing with the anxious attachment style, which is that a lot of anxious people, they end up with avoidant partners, because sometimes, opposites attract, and avoidance and anxious, they have a lot to learn from each other. But those relationships, they become incredibly toxic. It's very, very toxic for an avoidant, an unhealed avoidant, and an unhealed anxious person to be together. Because the avoidant will trigger the anxiousness in the anxious person, and the anxiousness will trigger the avoidance in the avoidant partner. And just very quickly here, avoidant attachment is where you're kind of very private about emotions. You're kind of emotionally shut off. You don't really let anyone in. You take care of everything yourself. You're over responsible. You don't rely on anybody. So it's kind of the opposite. You don't want to talk about conflict the same way that the anxious person wants to talk about conflict immediately and maybe even all the time, and sometimes even create conflict where there is none, right? Like, why didn't you call me? What's the problem? Oh, but I was just, I was busy. No, why were you busy? That kind of thinking, that's a very anxious way of thinking. So yeah, I can give you an example, okay, for real life. I'm making this up, okay, but kind of an example to help you understand how it can look in a relationship. So let's say that Allison, she meets Mike on a dating app. They text a little bit back and forth. In the beginning, she's pretty cool. She's the anxious in this story, okay? In the beginning, she's pretty cool. Everything's fine. They meet up, they go on their first date. They have a great first date because Allison, she's great at giving a first impression. She's a people pleaser. She knows immediately what it is that the other person is looking for. And then they have a good date. They say goodnight. They say goodbye. And then that same evening, Mike doesn't text her. So then her mind, instead of just thinking, let's see tomorrow. Like, she's not even considering whether or not she likes Mike. She's just so dead set on getting this text from him, validating that she was good enough in the experience, right? So because she's anxious, she's going to already start spiraling now that he hasn't messaged her the same evening, which would be perfectly normal to message the next day, right? That would be okay. That's nothing wrong with that. Because of her anxiousness, she ends up messaging him, even though she felt like initially she wanted him to reach out first. But okay, so she messages him. She wakes up the next morning, he hasn't replied. She sends a question mark, right? Okay, I'm giving you a bit of an extreme example here. So she's already messaged twice. Who knows? Maybe Mike was asleep when she messaged the night before and he hasn't woken up yet. It's still just morning. So this is an example of anxious behavior. And so this pattern is something that if it starts like this and it's not healed or controlled or managed, then it can really get out of control in relationships. So let's say Mike and Allison continue to date and end up in a relationship. Eventually, Mike is going to start feeling extremely suffocated by Allison and her insecurity. She might want to know where he's going, what he's doing. If he is not being 100% emotionally present with her all the time, which is what she requires, she will start spiraling. She will sometimes make a big scene, drama to get his attention, to get that emotional connection that she so desperately needs all the time, right? So it's a lot of work to be with an anxious person. And as a result of that, Mikey starts to kind of pull away a little bit because it's a bit too much for him. The more he pulls away, the more desperate Allison becomes. So now when they're not together, when he's at work, she'll message him 8 times, when are you coming home? Why can't you hang out tonight? Da, 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 da. And he'll just, he'll want to go out with his friends more and more. Basically just he'll slowly pull away. So you can see how this, and maybe in this case, Mike could be an anxious, an avoidant partner, but it could also just be a normal person. I think a secure person would have a little bit extra, extra energy to deal with the anxiousness, and maybe have a mature conversation with Allison about her needing to learn how to regulate her own emotions. So when she starts spiraling, before calling him or messaging him 20 times in a row, she needs to go in and meditate and regulate and take a deep breath and do breath work or whatever it is she needs to do, journal to regulate her own emotions. But if it's an avoidant partner, he'll just shut down more and more and more and more and more. This is a pretty typical anxious avoidant dynamic that we see happening again and again and again. And the key for the anxious person is to learn how to regulate their own emotions. You have to realize, if you're the anxious person, that most of your anxiety, unless you're in a relationship with someone who's actually abusive or actually toxic, like a narcissist or someone who has some kind of mental health disorder, then this anxiousness is not caused by your partner. This anxiousness comes from within you. And it's actually nobody else's responsibility to fix it. It's not your partner's responsibility to fix you. That's what a lot of anxious people, they feel. They feel like, I'm in a relationship now. This person is saving me. I'm going to be saved by this person. Nobody's coming to save you. Your partner can't save you. Nobody can save you. You have to learn how to calm yourself down, how to find that balance within yourself and validate yourself. And a great way to do that is working with professionals, is doing breath work and meditation and journaling and getting to know yourself, and maybe opening up the Pandora's box of childhood traumas and kind of clearing out the space so there's room for some new experiences in your life. If you have any questions, please comment below. If you like this video, you can like it, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you again soon.